Thanks for tuning in to Stay Sharp with Razorleaf, your secret weapon for all things digital and manufacturing. Today's episode talks about what is involved when migrating data from one system to another. There are many schools of thought of what data migration is, and Jonathan Scott and Jen Ferello break it all down in this podcast. Jonathan outlines all the things that need to be considered when planning a data migration, such as, do you need to move all your data to a new system or just some of it? What about the old data that you don't want to eliminate quite yet? What kind of vocabulary is used around data, and what kind are you using in your company? And what about security? If you are considering or in the process of managing a data migration project, listen in and be well prepared for the hidden challenges in the process. Let's listen in with Jonathan and Jen.
Welcome back to Stay Sharp. Today we are talking about digital product data migrations, what's involved. And I wanted to start off by first acknowledging I'm not here alone. Hi, Jonathan.
Indeed. We're both here to talk about this fun topic, Jen. I agree. Hello, everybody.
One of the things I wanted to do, and we do this fairly often, is make sure that we're getting our terms straight. Okay, this is particularly important for me because when I joined Razorleaf, I am more it's closer to a CAD background than PLM. So for me, migrations meant transferring from one CAD system to another. I'm going from CATIA to Ideas or to NX. That's where my background was, and that transition has its own problems, but it's different when you're going from PLM to PLM.
Yeah, I think that's right, Jen. There are a lot of moves or migrations that we can lump under that term, and we could be talking about a lot of things when we say the word migration. And it's important to try to differentiate and use the right vocabulary to make sure that we're clear. But I've had a lot of these conversations over the years, and I don't think that there is perfect vocabulary for it to differentiate because, it's just sort of flavors of the same thing that we're talking about. So to your point, a CAD migration, if you're migrating CAD platforms, some people would say translation, right? And that's fair because a lot of times you are translating formats. But the overall activity of getting from using one system to the other and making your data usable in the new system, folks will call that a migration. I can't argue with that. I think that's fair. When you go to move from one PLM system to another, I don't know if they use the words in quite the same way because they'll talk about the new PLM system, putting it in place and training everybody on how to use it. They'll talk about that as a deployment or an implementation, and then moving the data itself across, changing its format, they'll call that a migration. And it's like, well, now we kind of use the terms differently than we did when we were talking about maybe changing the CAD tool or the CAD system. And I don't know, if we went and talked to folks who were doing development and they were changing their development tools, would they use the same language? I'm not sure, but I think we're in the right ballpark.
You're probably right.
Yeah.
You're probably right. We were talking a little bit earlier, getting ready for this, about just going from one email system to another.
Right.
If you're using different tools, you're migrating your processes, you're migrating your data. The process itself is very similar.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of things that we can talk about today, whether we're talking about CAD translation and migration or whether we're talking about PLM or PDM system migration, that are going to be common things to think about and consider in the process and why people are challenged with this activity, even if the language isn't universal or the same necessarily. But I think it's an important topic to talk about because even though some of these systems, they hang around for quite a while, and they should because there's quite a learning curve to get used to them, the organization starts to depend on them. So changing them is a big deal. Even though all that's true, they do change, right? Because the software industry evolves and changes, and it's the same product isn't the leader forever. So you have to be prepared to do this. And, your business changes too. So there are lots of reasons why you might need to change. You need to be ready for it and prepare that you are just going to have to migrate at some point.
Right. Because it's, even if the products weren't changing, to your point, manufacturing changes, the enterprise changes, you can acquire companies and they have different systems. And you have to decide, okay, are you going to maintain those separate systems or are you going to actually, no, we're all going to move to this one. We're all going to move to this platform and we're going to bring all that data over. So, even if the tools weren't changing, your company is changing.
Yeah. Well, and there are other fun cases like that where, we've acquired someone. We've spun off a company. Those types of activities, you end up needing to migrate for those as well. And it could be, to your point, you may need to change the CAD tool and the format of the maybe the data that you're managing. Or it could be that you're just changing the container that it's managed in, or both. Or, like we mentioned a second ago, it's not just CAD models, right? Or mechanical CAD models. It could be electrical CAD models. It could be software development. It could be documents. I mean, I'll say luckily or unluckily, depends on how you look at Microsoft. But, we don't do a lot of translation of spreadsheets from like Quattro Pro to Excel like we did maybe 25, 30 years ago. A lot of documents and things like that, they are what they are. But a lot of the other, I think, models that we have in product development, those are vendor specific, what their formats are. And so whatever kind of models you have, whether it's, engineering-like models or financial models or other things, they may be in a format that means you have to change. And if you do, a lot of these concepts are relevant. I think one of the things that I like talking about, because I don't think this needs to be the case, is for a lot of people, migration is a dirty word. They talk about a project related to engineering tools or software, and the last thing they want to talk about is migrating. What do I do with my legacy data, my legacy tool, those sorts of things? And I know why it's a dirty word. These projects have challenges, and a lot of them have turned out very poorly. People get very frustrated with it. And in some ways, it can be a big waste of time if you don't do it, I'll say right. Maybe right isn't the right word, but if you don't do it well, it can be a big waste of time for a lot of people. So I get it. I get why it's a dirty word, but I think we should challenge that a little.
Well, change is hard, right? I mean, change is hard. Anytime you're going from one process, one tool, et cetera, to another, it's difficult to do. So if that's the case, what are some of the things that people need to do to be able to do that correctly?
Yeah, I can think of a handful of things that I would mention. I'm sure that you probably think of some yourself from the backgrounds with migrations that you've had. I'll say first is think about how do you clean up before you move, right? And I'm going to use an analogy of moving house, because I think data migrations are a lot like moving from one place to another, moving your home from one place to another. And one of the first things that I want to do is move less, move the minimum amount of stuff I have to move. And that starts with figuring out what you really need to keep and move, right? So clean up all the stuff that you've accumulated that you don't really want, don't really need, and you don't want in the new place. Set it aside, donate it, throw it away, do whatever you need to, but clean up. And I think that's very good advice in a data migration. I
think that's a good analogy if you think about it. The longer that you've lived in a house, the more stuff you have accumulated. So the longer you've had that particular platform or system, the chances are there's a lot of data in there that perhaps you haven't touched, don't need, haven't worn in the last 6 months.
Exactly. And that's, you just hit on a very important point. I think it also helps to have a little bit of that digital minimalist mindset, right? Just like if you were moving house, think about downsizing, right? It's not that you would necessarily downsize. You may be moving to a bigger, more capable system. But if you think about it as, well, I've got that new place, I want to take advantage of that new place, whatever that is, right?
I want all the clean stuff. I want all the nice stuff. I don't want my junk.
That's exactly right? So what is it that if you weren't moving, you feel like you have to have, that you'd never delete it? I'll give you a good example of this that comes up a lot in migrations, is in PLM system migrations, is work in progress data. Oh yeah, when I was working on that product 6 years ago, we had a bunch of intermediate revisions before we released it. And then before we got to Rev B, another 10 intermediate revisions. And, so that kind of revision history, that's not the released versions, not the versions you used, not the versions that anybody would ever go back and reference, but the ones that were in between, that were sort of like a temporary save or backup. People will hold on to those like it's gold. And it's, it's amazing.
I might need it.
I might need it, right? I might need it someday.
I might fit back in a pair of jeans.
Exactly. Or that, that dish towel that's sort of beaten up and looks like a rag, but, I've got 12 of them. No, I'm moving those. I'm keeping them. Never know when you might need them. I don't want to poke too much fun at this, but my grandmother, definitely from a different generation, but we had this closet of sheets in our house when I was growing up. At her house, I'd like, what's in that closet? It's a big closet full of like holy sheets and stuff. And, my dad would kind of poke fun at her because her answer to that, why do we still have those, is, well, you never know when there might be another war. I'm like, all right, well, okay. I don't think that we need the holy sheets when that happens, but
it is a mindset.
But it was that mindset. And like I said, I don't want to poke fun at that because I understand where that comes from. That's legitimate. But I think about that sometimes when people talk about, well, I got to have that data. And I'm like, if you could just see this through my eyes, you'd realize that, no, you don't need to have that data. It's getting in your way. It's not helping you out. You're never going to use it. But you do have to step back and kind of have that look at things. So that's one of the, I think, pieces of advice I would give.
So why would you, what are some of the challenges there? Why would you not want to? What's the downside of bringing everything?
Yeah.
Well, then I've got everything that I need, regardless. I can always find it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there's a school of thought that says, just bring it and don't spend the time trying to figure it out. Now, in my mind, one of the things that I talk to clients about is that being digital clutter. It's something that maybe a lot of us are familiar with, is just clutter in your mind. When you go to work every day, if you've got all these nagging things hanging out there, getting in your way, sometimes that really can get in your way. And not to say that things have to get in your way in a digital system, but they can. Are you bringing it over and really misunderstanding what you may do with it or that you may never use it? Be honest with yourself about it. And if it really is clutter, it can get in your way. Now, there's another element of that, which is depending on how much it is, it can also just not be worth it. I've seen lots of folks say, well, I just have to bring it all across. And there's this group of 15 records of something they tried to do 1 month, 12 years ago. And then they decided that wasn't a good process and they weren't going to keep doing it. But those 15 records are there. And they're like, well, I need to bring those over. I'm like, well, why? Do you use them? Well, no, we don't do it that way anymore. Okay, so it's not something you continue doing. Is there something important about them? Do you need to go back and look at those? Do you check them all the time, reference it? No, we've never looked at them. Okay, why are you afraid to get rid of them? Well, sometimes it's just that. I'm afraid. I don't know. I don't know if I might need it. But you have to push yourself a little bit to say, you know what? I could hold on to that another way, right? I could report it out, put it in a single file, put it in a zip file, I don't know, do something that gets it out of the way, archives it maybe so that you're not afraid that it's gone, but it's not in your way. You're not tripping over it in your digital house.
So you just need to be very intentional about what you are migrating.
I think that's right.
And your usage of it.
I think that's right. And if you are, another piece of advice I'll give you, it makes this next piece easier. If you're intentional about what you're bringing and you really spent some effort kind of separating the necessary from the, well, I thought maybe I need that, but I'm not sure I do. Then when it's time to be sure that it got moved correctly, and I'm talking about, data validation here, that in the destination system, is it there? Does it look like it needs to look? Is it right? Or, did somebody break the dishes during the move from house to house? You'll spend the time. If you know there's a limited amount of data that's critical to you, that's what you moved. But you'll get worn out and you'll lose momentum and lose steam in checking your data. The fifth pile of ratty dish towels that you go through when you're like, why am I looking at all this stuff? I'm sure it's all fine. And then off you go down the road, and then you don't realize that, your kitchen dishes were smashed because you were too busy checking through the junk that you moved. So to me, that being intentional is connected to that piece of advice of make sure you validate the migration after the fact. Make sure you check that things got moved properly.
Well, sure. Yeah, because if you don't validate, you may as well not have moved it almost. You don't have any assurance that it's the data that you need or it's in the form that you need.
That's exactly right. And there's a hidden danger to that, which is not always obvious to folks, but it's very difficult to go back after you have layered new data on top of old data in systems where there's, history and hierarchy and organization, PLM and PDM systems, management systems, period. So you go and you migrate all this data, and it turns out that there's maybe tons of problems with it, or the data's corrupt somehow, it didn't get linked right, whatever it might be. And then you start working with it, but some of this data maybe is you don't touch for a little while, and you come back to it, and that problem is latent. When it pops up and you say, okay, I need to go back to whoever migrated the data, and we need to fix this. Well, it may be that you can't fix it, or the fix of it is
or that person's not around anymore,
or that fix is very complex, right? Because, somebody has since used it, and now it's moved on in revision history, and you want to fix revs A through G, and you're on to Rev M. Oh, well, how do I fix that history? That's much harder than just loading A through G. So there's a hidden problem with validation. If you don't do it in a timely way, it's very hard to go back and fix it when you find the problem too late. I think there's another piece of the house moving analogy I want to highlight that I'm proud of myself for this one, because I think it's good, it's relevant, which is you have to think about how your data fits in the new house relative to where it fit in your old house. So, are the cabinets the same size? My kitchen cabinets, the shelves are shorter, so my blender doesn't fit. Okay, those are things to think about at a couple of different points in time. One, if you're buying a new house and it's really important to you because you've got a large collection of blenders, well, think about that when you set up the kitchen, right? So when you're setting up the new system, it's important to think about the kind of data that you have and what's important to you and how you want to use it moving forward. Not to say that your existing data totally needs to drive the way that your new house looks, but if there's things that are really important to you, consider that in your requirements. But the other piece is, now think about, how am I going to map things? How am I going to move things? And this is that process, if you're moving house, of labeling your moving boxes. Like, oh yeah, I know this was in bedroom 2, but now it needs to go to the upstairs office. Did you get things in the right place? And this is, the analogy probably breaks down a little bit here, but there's a lot of detail to this. Did I move the right records to the right types? Did I move the right fields on those records to the other appropriate fields? Things like, it used to be just a text field in the old system, but in the new system, it needs to be a pick from a pick list. Well, how does that look? What if I have text values that don't match entries in the pick list? Those are things you need to fix before you go and do the migration. There are lots of things like that you want to think about and be ready for, and recognize it's going to take time. It's detailed work, but just like a house move, the more effort you put in up front to planning it out and thinking about it ahead of time, the better the result's going to be on the day of the move.
I can tell you what, listening to all of this, I'm thinking, wow, it's clear why people hire movers.
There's no doubt about that.
Right? This is very complex.
It is. And that's, the analogy is very apt. That's why we have a business of doing data migrations, is just like movers at your house. They have the techniques, the tricks. They know, they've done this time and time again. They know where people are going to get tripped up. The movers show up. I don't know if you've had this experience. I've been moved, I think, maybe once in my life, where like professional movers showed up and they've got the right gear, right? They've got the boxes and the bubble wrap and the paper and the tape and the this and the that and the markers. I mean, they've got it all because they know what's going to happen, and they know if they're going to get through this efficiently, how the day needs to go. So they can guide you. They can't do it all for you, right? Even folks who say they will.
They can't come in and sort through your closets and say, yeah, you don't need these things.
Exactly. There's still pieces that you need to do, but they can provide a lot of help, right? And they know how to pack the truck, and they know how to unpack the truck, and they know, what order to get things where they need to go, and that whole mapping thing, right? They understand that concept too. How do I get the right things to the storage unit versus these need to go to the house, right? So I'll stop with the analogy, but I agree. You want someone who's done it before to help you through the process. I imagine that you'd say the same thing coming from the CAD migration and translation world, right? You don't want to just I'll buy a tool and see how it goes.
Oh yeah. I mean, and all of the same steps are relevant as well. You have lots of versions of a particular CAD file. You decide, okay, which ones are important? Do you just need the last version of it? Do you need the entire history? You decide where you're going, what type data you need to transfer, how to validate that it actually came across. There are tools to validate that whether or not a translation created changes in the file that were unacceptable. So yeah, I mean, all of the processes are the same. But I'm just getting back to, your analogy and the moving of the data and stuff. So getting back to the analogy of the movers and all the different things, the tools, et cetera, that they have, the steps that they take, what are some other things that when you're doing a migration that you really need to look out for?
Yeah. So I can start naming quite the laundry list, I think, of things that in system migrations, right? Management system migrations like PDM systems and PLM systems that people want to look out for and want to think about. And some of this will tie to mechanical CAD, things that you've probably seen too. I'll jump in. The first one is problems with the files, because a lot of PDM and PLM tools are about managing CAD data. And CAD data today is about models and drawings and file interrelationships. Even 20 years ago, right? If we were just dealing with AutoCAD and XREFs or things like that, you still had some file interrelationships. And you can have problems there. It's one of the reasons why people bought PDM and PLM systems to start with, is they were creating problems with file relationships pointing to another file that it couldn't find because somebody moved it.
Sure, missing links.
Or they renamed a file, but to your point, missing links. Or format problems. Here's a fun one that, you try to open up a software and the new software says, that file's so old, I can't read it. Oh boy, that's not good.
Format problems don't end there either.
Exactly.
Format problems are probably the biggest challenge in doing a CAD data migration.
Right.
Because they're different.
They are.
They're just different representations, and it's the process of translating, just like translating in a language.
And the mapping's not always direct, right? The mapping's not always one for one. Like what I did with a complex fillet over here, well, this new software doesn't do filleting like that. Okay, well, how am I going to approximate it in some similar way? But the software's got to help you figure that out. And you got to figure out, did that work? No, I've got a wide open hole in my geometry. Oh, fantastic.
That surface that was here and now is over there. That can't be right.
Exactly. So I think there are lots of problems you can have with the files themselves. That's one thing I would mention to people, make them think about. Another is with the metadata. So I touched on this one a minute ago when I said, you have to map your data and think about it, but maybe data doesn't fit, right? It doesn't fit in the destination the same way that it did in the source system that it's coming from. Or there are just rules, constraints that you need to deal with, like unallowed characters, right? We know there's all kinds of fun IT rules around that, like database security and, injection attacks because you put in a set of quotes somewhere and so now it interprets a string of characters as a command instead of a value. And so there's all kinds of goofy things you can do with, the back-end IT systems that mean the upfront tools say, look, you're not allowed to use a quote or a question mark or an asterisk or whatever in some of your file names, but maybe your source system said that was fine. Now, what do you do about that? Because problem B is going to lead back to problem A. Oh, I can't allow that character. Well, let me change the file name. I just broke the link, So it's like, you get caught in this circle of problems. I think another one that's tough, that a lot of people don't think about, and you can usually do this in a destination system, and that's rebuild your history, right? This is maybe unique to a management, a version control system, but you build up a version history over time. I made Rev B from Rev A. I made Rev C from Rev A. I made Rev D from Rev B. And knowing what came from where and when and who and what date and all that stuff is useful information. Usually. Sometimes that's digital clutter you don't need to bring across. I'll just say that. But when it is useful or important information, you have to think about how do you recreate that? And then when you layer this back on problem A that I mentioned earlier about the versions of files, you have to be very particular about how you do this. I've seen plenty of migrations from folks who maybe aren't aware of all these details, where it's like, yeah, I copied all the CAD files out, right? And then I'm going to move them into my new system. And I don't think I had any problems, but what they didn't realize is that they actually overwrote all of the earlier history with the later history because the files had the same name, right? It was called bracket, but inside the data management system, bracket, it kept Rev 1 of bracket separate from Rev 2 of bracket, separate from Rev 3 of bracket. But when they dumped them all out to move them into the new system, Rev 3 of bracket was the last one to come out. Last one wins. It overwrote the Rev 2 and Rev 1 bracket, and the history's gone, right? So rebuilding history is a process, and you have to think carefully about it. Or, you could really break things. And in the really tough part is you could misrepresent things, right? So I've seen people with the resulting system, they say, I've got all my history. I took care to rebuild it. What they didn't realize is they had that file version overwrite problem in the process. When they go back and look at it, it's like Rev A and B and C and D of the bracket all look the same because they loaded the same file. They thought they were different.
Because they were the same, yeah.
So anyway, rebuilding history is a challenge. Another one I see is user assignments. So a lot of what people care about in a PDM system is, well, who did that and when? Well, when you go to load new records in a new system, a lot of times it's going to assume, well, you're loading it now. So you, the administrator or the owner, and it got loaded today, as of today's date. But what you cared about on maybe the history of what was there when you moved it over is you wanted to know that Bob, who retired.
Who originally did it.
Bob retired 3 years ago. He's the one who did it. So if you want to go back and ask a question, he's the guy you need to talk to. That's valuable information sometimes. That is trickier than it looks because since Bob retired 3 years ago, he no longer has an active account. So in the new system, we didn't set him up. Okay, this gets back to the mapping problem. How did I bring that data over? Did I list Bob as the user? Did I have to create him an account? Do I need a license for him if I created so plenty of issues there. So those are some. I could go on and on. Matter of fact, there are a few more I probably should talk about, but I should pause.
So no, I mean, just again, listening to all of the complexity around this, and I wonder about the time that it takes to do a migration like this. I mean, if you've got specific time requirements or like how do you hit those windows? That's
another really key piece of migrations. And sometimes this is not a big deal, but sometimes it's a huge deal. That if you're trying to move from one system to another and you've got a bunch of people who use it, right? Like a whole team of CAD designers or the whole company using a PLM system, something like that, you don't want people to be without the tool for more than a couple of days, right? Usually a weekend is acceptable. If you shut down one system on a Friday and you bring up the new system on a Monday, okay, that's workable typically. It gets tougher when you're talking about global organizations, people working around the clock, people working 7 days a week or multiple shifts in manufacturing when they need to access this. That's when you start to get some really challenging constraints. And depending on what you're doing, how big the move is, and sometimes, what the systems are you're moving across, there are various things you can do, to strategies that you can put in place. One that is a challenge, but sometimes is necessary, is incremental migration, right? I'm going to take this project and move it over. I'm going to take this product line and move it over so that you can get it into bite-sized chunks or so that you can support the organizational change, right? That I can't move everybody all at once. I need to move people program by program or something like that. So those are things you can do, but they complicate the migration, right? And back to the house analogy. Imagine if, you live in a house.
You're living in two houses?
Yeah. You've got two houses at once and you need to move your spouse and one of your kids because they're going to start school in the new location, but you've got to wrap up your job and keep the other two kids at home. Okay. How do we move in that way? How do we get that done? So the analogy is still good because I'll give you one of the big problems. What about shared stuff, right? So I've got, libraries of parts, gears, bolts, nuts, washers, that kind of thing. Where do those live? Okay, I need them in both systems if I'm going to keep working in both, right? It's like the kitchen, right? Back to the blender. My wife and I both need the blender. Okay, what do we do? It's a similar problem. And you just have to work through it. You have to think about the details. You have to ask yourself things like, well, who's going to be changing the nuts and bolts? Are they read-only to both of us while this is happening and we've got two copies? How do I rationalize it after the fact? There are things to work through. You can get through it, but it's a challenge. But your original question was about, how do you fit timelines and performance and things like that? There are also special techniques and tools. It's like the mover analogy again. That's why you want to hire people who think about this and do this. Are there things you can do with parallelization? Are there things you can do with shutting down the system for user access and optimizing the back end while you load the data? There are a lot of techniques that you can look to to try and optimize that. So you can fit into a weekend. So you can fit into some kind of downtime window. But that's the trick, is you have to plan it, think about it. A lot of times you have to rehearse it to get performance numbers, to know what kind of window you can hit, to understand what you need to do to improve it to actually meet the need. But it's addressable. It's not simple.
Yeah, I would think rehearsals would be a really important part of this.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? Because you don't want to just hey, flip the switch.
Absolutely.
It's over there.
Absolutely.
Just use it.
That's important on so many fronts, right? So rehearsals are important, not just for performance, like you mentioned, but also to make sure you got the data right?
Well, and that's what I meant really more is just let's do this. Let's do this piece of data and check and see, yes, okay, that's all correct. Okay, now let's move a little bit more.
This is where the house analogy falls down, right? I mean, I don't know of anybody that actually rehearses their move. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there are people who do that. But I think it is important in a data migration because you can do it, and it really is a good idea to do it, to understand, do I have the right plan? Is the data mapped correctly? And are the techniques that the movers are using, are they going to work and get the result that I wanted? And a lot of times this is just about communication, right? It's speaking from our side of the desk, people who are the movers. We mean one thing because we know the data, we know the techniques, we have the vocabulary for this kind of thing. And sometimes customers mean something different, or we don't understand them correctly. And there's a lot of detail in what we're talking about. So rehearsals are a way to sort that out, to make sure that you get on the same page and understand each other clearly, and just to check, right? To check that everything worked.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds, regardless of what kind of migration you're doing, whether it's CAD to CAD, email to email, house to house, PLM system to PLM, it sounds like there are a number of processes that you're going through regardless. And you're planning things out. You're being careful about so you're rehearsing as you move. And then once data is over there, you're validating that, yes, it is in fact the correct data and everything looks good.
I think that's right. I mean, I think to your point, regardless of exactly what you're moving or the kind of move you're trying to make, those are important steps. There are a few others I would mention that maybe are unique to a PLM or PDM or some kind of management system, and maybe they're not. So you tell me. I think relationships and links are something that are kind of a hidden challenge a lot of times, because people will validate their data and say, yeah, my CAD files look good. I could open up my CAD assemblies and I could work with them. They're good. I looked at the documents. I opened those. They're good. I even checked the metadata. Is the revision history right? And those kinds of things. But if there are relationships like, oh, these files are stored in that workspace or folder or something like that, a lot of times those will get checked because that's how people think about finding their data. But the more subtle things, oh, is this file connected to that BOM entry? Usually if you're checking a bill of materials, those relationships, parent-child relationships, people check and think about. But those more subtle or secondary relationships that may be important, if they were important enough to move, then you need to make sure you have a validation plan for them, right? And that's one I think is worth noting, because I see that problem. And again, the more latent the problem, the tougher it is to solve later. Another one that's sneaky like that is security. So you had a certain security scheme in place in your last system. When you put the new system in place, you had those same requirements, and you told everybody about them, and you implemented them in the system in the way that you need, and you checked that out. But did the security get applied when the data got moved properly? Or have you accidentally exposed something, right? And that's the dangerous part, because the new system probably doesn't behave quite like the old system. So you have to think about the new behavior as it relates to the old behavior, and then how the data applies in that. So that's tricky.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, there are a variety of things that, regardless of the type of migration, apply. But then there are levels of complexity when you're talking about digital product data, when you're talking about PLM migrations. Okay, so the more we talk, Jonathan, and the deeper we dig into this, the more the complexity just seems a little overwhelming, like the size of the effort to migrate from one to another. Does anybody ever decide, take a look at it and be like, no, sorry, too much. I can't. You know what? I'm good.
Yeah.
I'm staying in my little house. It's fine. It's full of clutter. I like it.
I think that happens. I think that's a reaction that people have. I don't know that they always end up there, right? Because usually there's momentum like, well, you already bought the new house. So
yeah, there's no going back.
But I think there is an inclination, and I've seen people do this, to saying, well, you know what? It actually doesn't cost me that much to keep the old house, so I think I'll keep it. Right. And of course, the analogy breaks down here because we all know with houses, there's plenty of expense that you're not just going to hold on to one for fun. But with old.
Actually, I don't think the analogy does break down there.
Okay. No, you're right.
I mean, if you.
There's cost and expense.
There's maintenance. Exactly. And there's stuff that you left at the house and like now you have to go back and find it again. No. So I think the analogy still holds.
Yeah. But I do see people do that. Right. They say, well, what if I just park the old system, park it off to the side, right? Put it in read-only mode or something like that. And you can do that, but you mentioned something just a second ago that's exactly right, which is, all right, now I need to find something. Well, which house is it at? How much time does it take me mentally to go get in the old house and start rummaging around to find that thing I needed? And then when I do, and I have to work with it, do I bring it to my new house? And now the next time I need to find it, which house do I look in? Because the latest one's in my new house, but the old ones are in my, you can get yourself into a real mess with that kind of thinking. So I've seen people have that reaction. I've seen people do it. And then I've also seen people change their minds after the fact. Now, it's not to say, keep with the analogy, it's not to say that people won't buy a digital storage unit and say, you know what, I don't want to move all this stuff. I just want to go stuff it over there. And they do, right? They dump it out. We've helped people do this. And sometimes it's not the best answer, but it's a good answer for that fear response that I mentioned earlier. I don't have time to think through whether I need this stuff or not. I don't want to throw it away or donate it right now. I want to hold on to it for a little while and see if I need it. And then I'll figure out if I want to bring it into my new house. Okay.
Yeah, those are the digital hoarders we talk about.
They are. And if we're really lucky, they don't leave that storage unit behind after they pass on. They actually clean it out before they go. But I'll say the analogy in our world is archiving a system, right? And we've done that with multiple PDMs and PLMs where it's like, okay, let me actually pull the application out of the way, but you can hold on to the database. And maybe you don't even have to have it running. You store it, you've backed it up. And then the file system that went with it, you store that and back it up. And there's a way to trace those database records to those files. And you can get at anything you need, but it is a little bit like walking through a packed storage unit that like, well, when you need to find that thing that's at the back on the bottom left corner, you're going to be there all day trying to get it.
Might take you some time.
Right.
Might take you some time.
But I think that's a reaction to your question about when people say, look, I'm just not going to do it. So I think there are other ways of dealing with it than dealing with the complexity of the migration. My advice to people when they have that reaction, though, is, well, just simplify. Focus on the stuff that matters to you most, right? Focus on what you need to do to move forward. And if you have those issues of there's stuff I don't want to get rid of, maybe go for a strategy where you park it, you wait, you come back to it, whatever it might be. Not always the most efficient, but it's reasonable. You got to find what's right for you.
Right. And I think that's the answer for a lot of things. So I know we're getting to the end of our time here. What should somebody take away from this particular podcast as far as like data migrations?
Yeah.
Give us our top 3 or 4 things.
I would name a couple. I'd say one is the language is tough. Make sure that, you're spending time trying to use the right vocabulary and talking with people and they understand you and you understand them. And that's going to be the case throughout the migration. Are you asking for a migration or a translation? And is it data formats? Is it systems? What is it you're trying to do? I think talking with an expert is another one. Make sure that you're talking with somebody who has experience at doing this. It doesn't always have to be exactly with system A or system B. I don't think that's as critical as somebody who says, look, I've done this plenty of times before. I know the techniques. I know the gotchas. I know the things that could go wrong. It is helpful when the folks you're working with know one system or the other. So I shouldn't say that doesn't matter, but it's not always critical to say, have you done this exact migration before? A lot of people get hung up on that. That's not always what you need. I think going in with eyes wide open, because these kinds of projects have a bad reputation. Don't bring a lot of head trash, like, oh, this is going to be a disaster. But recognize that, the effort you put in will yield the results you want if you're working with somebody who has experience and you're willing to put in the time and the effort and the energy and be realistic about what you get out of it. So those are I think the big things I would say to somebody who's thinking about this, thing that I hope somebody takes away from our conversation today.
Well, but more specifically than that, I mean, those are almost the more mental aspects of it. I think the actual steps that we were talking about were, planning out the migration, taking the time to think about what it is you want to take over, what you don't need, either incrementally or rehearsing the procedure, checking and making sure that the data is there, that the links are there, that everything is there and where you need it to be and in the form you need it to be. And then once you do the migration, again, validating all that data is there and making sure.
I think all that's right. I think that's the recipe, right? Is plan, rehearse, check. That's essentially it. A lot more detail to it than that, right? Because the checking is complex and you need to think about it pretty deeply to make sure you've got it right. And hopefully you've got someone experienced to guide you on that. But I think that's right. That's the right advice. Folks who say, oh, it's just data, I'll just move it over once, or I'll just, engineers understand it, I'll just have the engineers do it. We'll brute force it. Those are risky strategies. So I think the advice that you said about the specifics is right on target.
Well, I want to, as we wrap up today, I want to thank Jonathan for joining me and to remind everybody this is a conversation. If there are topics that you want us to discuss, if there are questions that you have on this one or any of our other podcasts, please reach out. We'd love to hear from you.
Absolutely.
And until next time, stay sharp.
Bye, everybody.